Although the RF performance of this transceiver was good, there were two problems that made it slightly less than perfectly usable at certain times. The first was that it was crystal controlled on a single frequency, and if that frequency was busy, then you couldn't do much about it. You just had to listen. I overcame that by putting a switch and another crystal, so I can now switch between 7125, it's actually a 7122 MHz crystal with a low value capacitor in series, and this crystal here on 7159. Here in Australia, 7125 is the most commonly used AM frequency, but when that gets a bit busy, then I can go up to 7159, or near enough. I've just got the switch inside the transceiver. Maybe that's not ideal. Maybe it would be nice if it was on the front panel, but an important thing was keeping the leads short around the crystal oscillator, which I've done. So I thought, well, I'd go for the switch inside because I'd set up this transceiver so it was very simple to remove the back panel. That was no hardship, as I built the transceiver with the back easily removed, using Velcro straps rather than screws. The extra crystal is a fairly common frequency, 7159. It's actually double the colour burst crystals, which are 3.5795 MHz. So that's what I chose for the second channel. If you want to change the frequency of this a little bit, you can put inductances in series, a few microhenry, maybe 10 microhenry, maybe more. That will get the frequency down. You might be able to pull it down to maybe 7156 or 7157. Or if you wanted to pull the frequency up a little bit, then you can have a low value series capacitor, maybe around 10 or 20 picofarads. If you wanted a bit more pulling range, then you can put two crystals in parallel and get a bigger shift, maybe 10, 20 or more kilohertz. I've done other videos that discuss that for CW transmitters. I've put in the switch and now have two channels on transmit, 7125 and 7163. The other problem I found was the receive tuning range. This transceiver has a free-running oscillator for its receiver. That gives you frequency agility on receiving, but a problem was that the adjustment was quite finicky. It covered a much bigger range than I needed. You can see the elements in the local oscillator here. This is the variable capacitor, and here is the inductor. And right where my finger is on the far left is the NE602 used for the receiver front end. And then there's the IF cans here. So what I want to do is to narrow the range of the local oscillator, so tuning is much easier. First thing I did was I removed one of the leads. It's actually this purple or blue lead here. That's loose. I've just unsoldered it, and the reason for that is I wanted to measure the value of this variable capacitor. Not only the value where the receiver was tuned to 7 MHz, but also the maximum and minimum range. The idea is to reduce that range so that we have easier tuning of the frequency range that we want, just in the 7 MHz emitter band. To measure capacitance, I'm using the LCR45, a handy little inductance capacitance meter. I've reviewed that in a previous video. Anyway, around the desired frequency, it's around 72 picofarad. The maximum capacitance is 273, and the minimum is around 16. So with that big range, you can now see that that's going to cover a very large part of the HF spectrum, way more than this receiver needs, as it's a single band transceiver. So here's our variable capacitor. We want to cut off a lot of the top and lower range. We need something narrower, around 70 picofarad. So if we want to cut the top end off, you do that with a series capacitor. Now if you want to cut the bottom end off, then you need a parallel capacitor, and these are fixed capacitors. Now, how do we calculate these values? You could use formulas, and in a critical application you would, but let us say that, okay, we want around 73 picofarad. The absolute highest capacitance, well, if we made it 100 or 120 picofarad, then that would reduce a lot of this range and make it a lot easier to tune. And for that, well, if that's 273 picofarad, if you put 270 in series, then two capacitors of equal value in series, that will halve the capacitance, so we're now down to 135 being half of 270. So that is not a bad starting point. And just doing that by itself will make the tuning much, much easier. Now, one issue when you put capacitors in series is it's not particularly important, but you will get a very non-linear capacitance range. All the frequencies will be crowded at the top end of the band, a bit like when you're tuning an AM broadcast radio. You'll notice the spacing between stations is much less, around 1500, 1600 kilohertz, than it is around 530, 600, 700 kilohertz. This particular transceiver doesn't have a dial, so absolute linearity isn't important to me, but I do want it to be not extremely non-linear, and that's where putting a parallel capacitor can really help. Now that will also change the tuning range a little bit, but very roughly, if you were to put and I'm completely guessing out, 47 picofarad in parallel with that, that will greatly improve the linearity. In fact, it would be even more linear if you had 100 picofarad. And if you had 100 picofarad, then that would reduce the tuning range a bit, but that's okay. We want a lower tuning range. Because even though we're increasing the maximum capacitance here, if we put 100 in, we're going up to 373, but we've got this new series capacitance which limits the maximum you can get. So if that's 270 in series with 373 will be, I'm going to guess, probably around 170, 180, certainly no more than 200. And if that's too much, then you go for a lower value of capacitance here, maybe instead of 270, 220 or 180, and that will get you back to the same maximum capacitance we had before we added this parallel. If you do a Google search for series capacitance calculator, you'll find some that give you the formula and also have a thing that you can just put in the values and it will give you the resultant capacitance. This one is on the DigiKey website, so we'll try that one. Now let's do the calculation. We've got the series capacitance, which I've called CS, 270, CP as 100. The range that we're getting is 100 plus what we're getting from the variable capacitor, so that's 116 to 373 picofarad. Okay, 270 in series with 116 gives us 81 picofarad. Then when we do the same thing for 373, we get 156. Well, the guess I got before was wrong. We've got too much capacitance. 81 picofarad minimum, 156 maximum. Whereas to tune our desired frequency we needed only 73. So we have to change some of these values. Either we could make the parallel capacitance a lower value. That will certainly get a lower capacitance overall, but it will be a bit non-linear towards the top end of the scale. Or we could reduce the value of our series capacitance here. I happen to have capacitors 220 picofarad and 68 picofarad. So we'll try them. Series and parallel capacitors respectively. That's a lot better, giving us a 61 to 133 picofarad range. Here's another pair of capacitors. 181, I could use that for the series, and 47 for the parallel. With our pair of those capacitors, and I'm tempted to use those first, if only for the fact that they look old, worn and have short leads. Then I get a range of 46 to 115. We know that the desired frequencies are around the 73 picofarad position, which is about midpoint. So we know that we're going to get good coverage of our desired frequencies and a bit either side. Now I could use an online LC calculator to work out the exact resonant frequencies, and note that this is actually different frequencies to the incoming signal because it's a superhet receiver, and all this is for the local oscillator values. I know that the IF is 455 kHz, so the local oscillator for this will be either around 7.6 or about 6.6 megahertz. I don't remember whether it was low side or high side. But anyway, I'm not having a dial, so I don't need to do those more detailed calculations. I can just put the capacitors in and be happy that the desired frequencies will be around the midpoint of this range. First thing I want to put in is the 47 picofarad in parallel with the variable capacitor. I don't want to pull this whole thing apart, and the variable capacitor is glued to the front panel, so I need to reach in. So I've just got a bit of enamelled wire here. It's waving around a bit, but anyway, I will tack solder this to the leads of the variable capacitor, and then I'll solder it properly, because once you've got one tack soldered in, you can solder the second lead properly and then go back and apply proper soldering to the first. And of course there's some wires here, and we don't want to burn those with the iron either. Here I'm at the very lowest frequency part of the range. The local oscillator is at 6.464. Now, when I keep tuning up and I'm following with the receiver local oscillator, I end up going a lot higher. Even there. even there. Even we're above 8 megahertz. And this is pretty close to the top. So the receiver's actually covering, or the local oscillator is actually covering a 1.5 megahertz range. So it's still more than desirable. It's a lot better than before, but it's still more than you need for just covering the 7 megahertz part of the band. And our 115 picofarad, which coincides with our bottom band edge, that's fine. It's just the 46 we've got here is way too small. So we go back to the first idea we had, which was 100 picofarad in parallel. Now, we know that 270 in series is way too much. We get a too big a tuning range, 81 to 156. But the big problem is the 156. We need to drop that maximum somehow. So we do need to drop the 270 picofarad to a lower value. The series at 180, parallel at 100. That's changed the tuning range 70 to 121. That's lowered the tuning range quite a bit, from 70 to 121 picofarads. Therefore, instead of a 1.5 megahertz tuning range, I think it would be more like 800, maybe 700 kilohertz. Here it is, all done. Let's give it a test. Well, it's drifting a bit, but the top frequency is much lower at just under 7.4. So when we add 455, that's under 8 megahertz. And we go down. And remember, this is the local oscillator, so it's going to be below the frequency that we are receiving at. We were around 6.5 for our bottom end. Uh, 6.354. So we'll actually be receiving signals well below 7 megahertz, but that's okay. Not so much in Australia, but in some countries there's pirates and other interesting transmissions below 7 megahertz. So this receiver will cover that. And being an AM receiver, the tuning is much less finicky than with SSB. So it's okay if you've got a wider receiving range, even if you don't have a very good dial or a reduction drive, because you can still tune in signals quite easily if you're monitoring AM signals. Final step is calibrating the dial. The two little dots coincide with my crystal frequencies.
VK2WD, VK3YE. Yes, congratulations on the home brew. It's working tip-top, like you're 100% perfect. It's super clear. Home brew, so however you've done it, whoever's designed it, or you designed it yourself, it works very, very well.
If you've enjoyed this video and are starting out, or know someone starting out in ham radio, consider my books on the topic. In the USA, consider Ham Radio Get Started. And in Australia, the Australian Ham Radio Handbook. These books give you ideas on facets of amateur radio, what you can do with it, and the basics of setting up a station. There's also a lot of detail on making contacts, something that beginners often stumble with. Books are available on Amazon by searching their titles, or you can learn more from my website vk3ye.com.